Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm here, as always, with Dr. Justin Smith.
Happy to be here.
We are going through the Gospel of Mark together, and we are coming towards our conclusion. We have just 3 episodes, including this one, left, and we started back in March during the pandemic.
Yep.
And as that started to focus and center our thoughts on Jesus during this time, I would not have expected that the pandemic would be affecting us as much as it still is, but it is a blessing to be able to go to God's Word and center ourselves on the person of Jesus. If you have any questions about Jesus, about a relationship with God, you can reach out to me, Brian with a Y at Glendale.Church. Send me an email. Love to hear from you. Any feedback that you have would be awesome. And you now have access to this until the internet collapses at some point, maybe as
That's
robot lords take over someday, far off in the distance. So this will be up forever. So anytime you run across this, please email me. Let me know. It'd be great to hear from you. We are looking towards the end of the Gospel of Mark, as I mentioned, starting in Mark chapter 14, verse 53. The conversation that Jesus has as his trial happens before the Sanhedrin, and then his conversation with Pilate. We aren't going to read through those, but I find them somewhat similar in what is going on and Jesus's position with power and authority, dealing with hard questions and what it is that he's experiencing. So first, what's the Sanhedrin, Justin, for those watching
So
at home?
the Sanhedrin would have been, we think, the ruling council there in Jerusalem. It's a combination of sort of a bunch of different social groups, as it says here, high priests, chief priests, teachers of the law, probably some Pharisees, some Sadducees. This group that would have gotten together and weighed in on political issues, cultural issues, religious issues, legal issues. Again, remembering that in the Jewish world, in the first century world, all of that stuff comes together. So you don't make religious decisions that aren't political decisions. You don't make political decisions that aren't religious. Political and religious decisions have cultural ramifications, and all of that is going to be connected to the law and interpretation of the law in one way or the other. So we think that this group would have functioned as a way of dealing with some of these larger issues, political issues, religious issues, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find this interesting. Just it's this position that Jesus has with power and authority, and yeah, the religious people, it kind of just goes all hand in hand. It's all mixed up, and I think throughout history we've seen that maintained, the relationship that Christians and the church have with politics and power. And that's an interesting conversation, of course, with the backdrop of the election. I don't know if anyone's aware watching at home, but we have an election coming up. You probably have heard or at least run across a commercial. And I think it's just interesting to see, similar to the story of Jesus looking at the coin and saying, no, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, just the nonchalant nature that he has in these moments as his life is on the line.
Yeah.
And saying things that are important and significant, but just not getting too anxious or filled with all these questions, or it's like he's just okay, this is what's going to happen, I guess. And to the frustration of the political leaders, so like, well, we're going to slam you with our authority, and he's just like, okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think some of what we forget, and I think all of this kind of works really nicely in this conversation. You know, we're getting near the end of this week. This is sort of the Passover week, or leading up to Passover. Jesus and his disciples have just had the Passover meal. The Passover is the celebration of freedom from foreign domination, freedom from slavery, freedom from power. This is when the people of Israel pack up and God intervenes in a unique and powerful way. He kills the firstborn of every man, woman, child, animal, thing in Egypt. And the people get up and they get ready to leave. And it's God passing, the angel of death passing over their house. So it's all of this really rich religious imagery. The population of Jerusalem would double probably during this time, maybe even 500,000 people in Jerusalem for Passover. Beginning of the week, as we've discussed, Jesus comes in heralded as king. This is viewed as a political takeover, and it's happening during Passover. I mean, like, what better holiday season, what better time for this to happen than this celebration of foreign domination while you're being dominated by foreign power? You know, there you have the Roman fortress above the temple, looking down on the temple, taller than the temple. You know, all of this like really strong, powerful language and symbolism. And so, you know, as we start this experience, it's the religious leaders, the political leaders of the people, the legal scholars that are all getting together to figure out, okay, who are you? Are you the Messiah? What does this look like? And I think as you and I were discussing, where do we fit into your vision of sort of the messianic reign? And I think it's very clear very early on in that week that they don't fit into Jesus's vision, at least in the way that they want to. And so now we've been on this sort of political, religious collision course throughout this week, and then now it's coming to a head. So I think we want to make Jesus apolitical, but the problem is everything is political in the first century world. So if Jesus is existing in that world, then he's inherently political in one way. He may not be a politician. Maybe that's the distinction that we draw, because I think sometimes we see politicians now and say, well, are you saying Jesus is a politician? No. What I'm saying is what he's saying and doing has political ramifications. So thinking about it in that way, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and I think that when we read the Gospels, we always read it with the whole gospel in mind, and the cross being like the thing that it's like all kind of funneling to. But for exactly as you were saying, for the people who were experiencing it, like this is what it's heading towards. It's all right. You have your day in court to say, and you have the opportunity to take up your sword to just do what is it that you're going to do to overthrow this political regime that is unfair and unjust and broken and hurting people. Like, what is it that you are going to do? And so that is the title bout. It's the boxing match. It's Jesus versus the corrupt government and politicians, and everybody's just anxiously awaiting what it is that Jesus is going to do. And he's just so calm and just doesn't really even lift a finger almost. And it's that would have been just so disappointing and shocking to the people of that time, because this is what we are looking forward to. We're excited about this. And then Jesus is like, just whatever. Like, I'm not going to fight this.
Well, and I think too, I mean, maybe what it also comes down to is Jesus, being the antithesis of king and leader, being the antithesis of sort of, awe-inspiring political entity. He's not Caesar. He's not King David. He's not, the rebellious revolutionary leader that is going to stand up and make this really long, powerful speech that draws all the people together to fight out, to fight against the Roman government. He's much more measured in his approach, I think, and he's much more calm, and he's much more directed, and there's still this way that Jesus is modeling the peace of the kingdom in his behavior. And I think sometimes we don't get that either. He's working to model this reality all the way through, from the beginning of his life to the end of his life. He's modeling what it looks like to be king and kingdom in the kingdom of God. And I think that's a really important, powerful point to be thinking about here.
And I think it speaks to just the dangers of the intersection of religion and politics in a negative way.
Yeah, sure.
Where it's not healthy or helpful when religion or politics are coercing each other and in cahoots and trying to do this in this way. There's a author named Walter Wink, who says this: what killed Jesus was not irreligion, but religion itself, not lawlessness, but precisely the law, not anarchy, but the upholders of order. Jesus was not only innocent, but the very embodiment of true religion, true law, and true order. This victim exposed their violence for what it was, not the defense of a society, but an attack against God.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful to think of it in that way, because we can sometimes think of the systems that we have, both religiously and politically, and sometimes we can dwell on how insufficient they are, and certainly that's true. Like it's the church has failed historically to live out the model of Jesus. The government has as well. Governments throughout history, it's
Sure.
absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's just going to be failings, and that doesn't mean that we don't fight for more justice, that we don't try to make a difference, and perhaps you're called to go into politics and like help create a better system, but those systems are going to be broken and are going to fail. Like they're not going to be like, I know of people who are so obsessed with Donald Trump and everything that he tweets that they've given him too much control over their life. And similarly, I think there were people like Barack Obama, haters, who were the same way, that it's just, you're giving that person so much power over you. And I just think the way that Jesus approaches this could be helpful for all of us as we think about a very heated political season, a very divided time right now, that it's not that it doesn't matter, and that some of us are called perhaps to give our lives to working in it and making it better, and we are all called to vote and participate and help to create a more just world and society. But at the end of the day, an awareness of the brokenness of broken people trying to lead these things and how it gets just messy and messed up. And I just think at times we can become so focused on our own political party or the way that we see things and put that above the kingdom of God, which we need as Christians. If you're not a Christian watching this, welcome. We're glad that you're here. But for those who are Christians who are watching this, we need to recognize that the kingdom of God is our first and foremost identity. So it takes a bit of the pressure off and helps us to breathe a little bit as we think about the direction of our world. And there's often fear on both sides. And Jesus, even though he's facing something that he needs to be more afraid of than he actually is, and just a few verses earlier in the garden, he is very nervous and filled with anxiety about it. But as he's dealing with the political powers, he's not acting and reacting out of fear.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because there's a lot of fear swirling around him in this context, where as we see this section of chapter 14, starting in verse 53 or so, there are a lot of people who are afraid of him, and they're afraid of his message, and they're afraid of what he's saying and doing, and they've gathered together witnesses. And it's really interesting in Mark's gospel, on more than one occasion in this sort of section here, Mark notes that the witnesses that are bearing false testimony against Jesus can't get their story straight. They can't get their testimony straight. That I have to imagine that there's a wide variety of people with conflicting stories about what Jesus is saying and doing, and none of it makes any sense. And it's interesting the sort of confused, lawless, stuff that's going on in the midst of this group of people who have been charged in one way or another with upholding the law and interpreting the law effectively and honestly. And even in the midst of all of this, there's all of this sort of deep turmoil as people are deeply, deeply afraid of who Jesus is and what his vision of kingdom ultimately represents for them, or doesn't represent for them, maybe is another way to think about it too.
And I think it's fascinating, as I just was looking at these two conversations, and Jesus says two words before the Sanhedrin.
He does.
I am, which are very significant. And he then continues a little bit on that thought, but I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then that's the statement that is recorded there that Jesus makes. And then with Pilate's just confused, doesn't know what to do with him, because people who are around Pilate generally are begging for their lives, and Jesus just responds, "You've said so." And that's that. So these statements that are short, I think something that reveals to me, I know that I often, as I am nervous or stressed about a situation, I want to fix it with words. I want to sometimes chase words afterwards, just keep saying things to keep out in front of something. But Jesus, as he's in this anxious moment, he's just going to say a few things, and they're important, the I am statement for sure, but he's just not going to try and just fix this by talking too much.
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of something I read or heard at one point. I'm a big jazz fan. I don't know that you and I have talked about that as much, but somebody was interviewing Miles Davis, or they were talking to Miles Davis or something, and they were talking to him about his style, or how he kind of got his sound. And I'm probably butchering this a bit, and I'm probably getting this wrong in lots of ways, but Miles Davis's response was that essentially he tried to play less notes. He tried to play fewer notes. So instead of filling, that space with all of these different notes, which sometimes can happen in jazz, if you're not a big jazz fan, it may sound like noise or kind of strangely, put together, especially with improvisation. But his approach was to say, look, I can fill that space with silence as much as I can fill it with all of these different notes. And when you go back and you listen to some of his most iconic recordings, you'll hear one of my favorite albums of all time, Kind of Blue. I mean, it's sort of ubiquitous in the jazz world. When you listen to him play on that album, he's not just filling it, he's really kind of letting the silence kind of come into that as he's playing, within those boundaries. So in some ways, I see Jesus doing the same thing here. It's not filling the space with words. It's not filling the space with sound. It's saying just what needs to be said. It's I am. And then it's this callback, by the way, not only to Daniel 7 and the Son of Man figure in Daniel 7, but it's a callback to chapter 13, where he says in verse 26, "At that time people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels to gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth and the ends of the heaven." This is in Mark 13. We call this the little apocalypse in Mark. Jesus in Mark 13 kind of gives us this discussion of the end times. So Jesus is drawing back into what he has said about the end times with the Son of Man. He's drawing us back to Daniel 7 and the sort of apocalyptic divine Son of Man figure. But he's also using this language that God uses in the burning bush. When Moses asked God, who should I say sent me? God says, I am. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, in the Greek it says, ego eimi, I am. Jesus says right here in Mark, in Greek, ego eimi, I am. There's this interesting callback to all of these different parts of Israel's history in this one moment, from Daniel 7 to the Exodus to the overarching context of Passover. And Jesus is saying less, not more. Speaking of saying less and not more, we were talking about our friend, one of the brothers here, Sean, who cuts hair. The first time I went to Sean to get my hair cut, I was explaining how I wanted my hair cut, which is really no explanation needed. I have had less hair for a good long time, and so I was explaining this, that, or the other. And he said to me on more than one occasion, say less. Say less. You don't have to tell me how to cut the limited amount of hair that you have. I know how to cut.
He also does my hair, which is a real masterpiece.
So it's say less. So I think sometimes play less, sometimes say less. Because the silence itself is deafening in this context of, I don't need to fill this room with testimony. My life is my testimony. This death will be my testimony. This resurrection will be my testimony.
Yeah. And I think the power just the power of presence and
Yeah.
standing in that space and not cowering in fear, standing firmly, saying a few things. You mentioned a hard time in your life when a friend of yours just sat with you and watched shows and it helped. And I think that we don't give ourselves enough credit for just how just being in a room with somebody, just like walking with them and saying nothing is really powerful. But it's like I'm choosing to show up with you. I'm choosing to be
Yeah.
in this space, and it's really powerful.
Yeah. So what Brian's referring to is I was telling him when I went through my divorce, my best friend would come over to the house and we would just sit there and watch One Tree Hill for hours on end because nothing really speaks to a grown man's pain like the pain of teenagers and what they're going through in their drama. And we didn't talk a lot. At least I don't remember us talking that much. I think we just kind of sat there and we were just present, and just having somebody be present and not talking because part of the thing with pain and grief is that we've kind of come to this conclusion that we think that we have to say a bunch of stuff when people are going through difficult things. Generally speaking, what we have to say doesn't help. I've tried to offer kind words when people are going through things. I don't think it helps that much, but what helps is being there and being present. And I think again something like this where Jesus here is being present in what's happening, and I think again is just kind of drawing us into the circumstance, drawing us into that space. You always kind of see that at the beginning of the movies, which most of us haven't been to in quite some time now, but the whole silence is golden thing that they'll say is they want you to turn off your cell phones and be quiet. In many ways, Jesus' most effective and most powerful testimony, his whole life, is in the silence that essentially he observes here in this questioning, and then ultimately in the questioning before Pilate. He just doesn't say a lot, and I think it speaks volumes.
Yeah, no, and it does. And I mean, I think there's parts of each of these scenes that are gripping. I mean, the idea of the crowd just shouting, "Crucify him," and like just thinking of what that would have been like in that moment and experiencing that is
it. I don't know. I read all of this now very, very politically, kind of in the way that we were talking before. I read this through the joy and the exuberance and the expectation of the people at the beginning of this week, when during what we now call Palm Sunday, they see Jesus as King. They run out to meet him on the road. They have heard about him. Some of them have probably seen the things that he's done, and they're going, this is the Messiah. This is the one that God has promised. We've literally been waiting centuries for God to intervene with someone like this. And they've been disappointed before, and they'll be disappointed again, but they are so hopeful that this is it. And the week starts out really pretty good. He acts out against the temple. He critiques the temple. He says the things that I think many people have been thinking.
Yeah.
He's preaching and teaching in and around the temple for the better part of a week. I think people are really, really excited. And here now we have this moment, we have this scene. It's the Messiah versus Rome, Jesus and Pilate face to face, where Jesus has this moment to strike a blow for the revolution, to say the thing that will start the movement, to call down, thunder from heaven, who knows, whatever. To call down the lightning, to just be the Messiah that the people have been anxiously wanting, this warrior king. And he says nothing. Are you the king of the Jews? He says nothing, or really kind of deflects, well, you say so. When pressed, when this moment, right, it's just, you could probably just feel the electricity in that space. And the people have been anxiously awaiting, like, this is it, this is the moment, and he says nothing. And I think we can't underestimate the disappointment of the people because he's not the Messiah that they want. He's the Messiah they need, but he's not the one that they want. And because he's not the one that they want, they reject him. This is yet another pretender. This is yet another fake Messiah. This is yet somebody else who's talked a good game and done, really fantastic things. But when push comes to shove and it's time to destroy Rome, either they don't get it done or they don't even try. And the people are just fed up with this, and they just say, fine, crucify him, get rid of him. He's not our king. And it's just, I don't know why, Brian, but it just took me a very, very, very long time, I think, to read through this in a way to understand why the people react the way that they react. I think I always read it the way that a lot of us have been taught it, this just sort of hard-hearted kind of like negative approach of the people. It took me a long time to get sympathetic or to become sympathetic to the view of the people, to go, we've been anxiously awaiting God's deliverance, and they just couldn't understand that this was how God was delivering them. And so they reject him. That's not what we want.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very powerful moment for us to reflect on the way that, oftentimes we're confronted with the Christ that we need, not the Christ that we want. And how willing are we to reject Christ because Christ doesn't fit into the box that we've set? This is the Savior that I need. This is what I need you to do for me. And when Jesus doesn't conform to that, where does our faith and our faith experience intersect?
And definitely that pain of rejection is so significant. And I think we can skip over it and miss the human Jesus going through that. I think it's those moments of rejection that we experience personally that transform us and in hard ways. I was in fourth grade. I have the story of starting a new school in fourth grade. We've been in 1 till 3rd, and then just didn't know anybody. Went out to play kickball, and I got picked last because apparently I looked like I couldn't really do anything. And the best part is the guy, then as I'm going up to kick, he says, well, I'll run for you, because apparently it looked like I couldn't even kick and then run around the bases. That's how poor it looked. And I kicked really far, an obvious kickball home run, and the guy ran for me and then scores, and then they were like, oh, you can't have somebody run for you. So they had me re-kick, and this time they backed up and they caught it. But it was like a couple kicks that gave me some respect. But I'll remember that feeling of just that being picked last, nobody knows who you are. And I think included in this, and I wanted to get to this before we get to the end, there's these little notes in this story that I think we can just read past, that they back up in 14, verse 65, they spit at him, they blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and the guards took him and beat him. And then verse 15, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged, handed over to be crucified. And then right after that, verse 16 through 20, that the soldiers are just mocking Jesus. They're saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And those things in my reading often had been just, these little like random parts of the story. Like I don't really understand why that's in there, because what we often do is focus on the pain of the cross. And I was on a youth retreat as a kid in high school where it's like we thought all about the pain and what that would have been like. And I think that's important and significant, and we need to do that. But we don't think about the shame, like these things where a human is getting mocked, getting rejected. And as I think about that personally in my life, when I think about those rejections, and it's not kickball for me anymore, but when I get rejected by somebody, when I experience that pain and that heartache and the difficulty that comes from that, and just shame, when I experience shame, it's really helpful to think of Jesus experiencing that too. Yeah. And him just have the ability to just snap his fingers and just, I generally don't have the way to make it all right, or, go explode my enemies or something. But I haven't thought of that. But as I think about this, the shame that he's experiencing is along with the pain just so significant and important. And these aren't just random things. Like for hours, him being spit on by people, like just imagine that. And as I think about the shame, it's such an important thing that we recover and understand that that's part of what Jesus is doing here too.
Yeah. I think the shame is definitely part of it, and I think the embarrassment. I don't know if Jesus was embarrassed. I suspect that he was because human beings get embarrassed. And the times in my life, I think, when I've been the angriest and have probably acted out the most are times when I've been embarrassed.
Mm-hmm.
Where someone embarrassed me or I, embarrassed myself. And there's a certain amount of shame and embarrassment that's going on here. I mean, ultimately, Jesus is going to be stripped naked and crucified naked for the entire community to see his, just nailed to this cross, his naked body, like you said, spit at, beaten, insulted, nonstop for hours on end. I've been spit on. It took every fiber of my being not to turn that into a fight. This was actually in football practice. I had a guy spit on me in practice, one of my own teammates. And it really took a lot for me not to just rip my helmet off and then maybe rip his helmet off and turn it into something else. But yeah, I mean, this idea of the embarrassment and shame that Jesus goes through for this whole period, from the, and it goes all the way back to, rejection by his own disciples, being handed over by his own disciples, rejected by his own people, spit at, insulted, beaten again. I mean, it's an intense period that Jesus goes through that we always sort of condense to the moments on the cross, not remembering that he's on the cross for hours, multiple hours, but then almost this 24-hour period, just about, from garden to breathing his last, of just pain and embarrassment and shame for nothing that he had done. Not really, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's pretty awful, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think it's helpful to recover this understanding. These aren't just random things that are in there, and it's what we all experience, where some of us will die a very painful death. Hopefully that's not true. Hopefully you go in your sleep someday. That would be wonderful. So we're all rooting for. But as we think about the pain of death, and then just the shame that we experience in life when we lose a situation, just have something happen, it's like we can react, and you're exactly right. I've made mistakes out of embarrassment in my life, and it's not helpful.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what we discussed last time, if it's here for a reason in the text. So maybe sometimes when we read these parts that we don't understand, we continue to pause and spend some time there and say, why is this here?
Yeah,
what is this
and it is
to?
important. We are out of time. We're in our last minute here. Yeah, there's just so much that you could say about all these passages. But thank you so much for joining us. Justin, thank you as always for being here as well. We have just a couple episodes left as we'll continue our study of the Gospel of Mark. As always, please email me if you have any questions, Brian with a Y at Glendale.Church. I'd love to hear from you. And just any questions you have, I would love and be happy to respond. You could also email me for the link to join our prayer Zoom call, which is at 8 p.m., so just in a couple minutes. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a blessing to speak into your life. Have a great evening.